The city shone like a tamed constellation, and yet Alejandro watched those lights through the dark glass of his car with the certainty that glory could also be a burden. They called him the king of finance, the serene strategist, the man who turned risk into a symphony of victories. Around him were useful smiles, polished toasts, handshakes that perfumed the skin but never touched the heart. That night he returned home carrying the fatigue of a man who wins but never rests, a weariness deeper than the body's exhaustion. The mansion welcomed him with the silence of a flawless hotel. The marble stretched out like a white lake beneath the soft lights, and the works of art stayed perfectly in place, watched by invisible censors. Order was his private religion. Suit in the closet, watch on the leather tray, phone on night mode, the next day's agenda on the desk with a perfectly weighted pen. Everything followed a method, as if every object were a piece in a chess match that always ended in the same conclusion. Alejandro had learned to distrust beauty that came too easily. In golden halls and business forums, in charity breakfasts and black-tie dinners, there were glances that sought his signature before his laughter. He knew how to listen, and how to stay silent. He would sip his drink, ask just enough, appear in photos that ended up in magazines he never read, and at the end, when the laughter faded, he returned home with his armor intact and an emptiness that no metal could fill. The staff moved through the mansion like a silent clock. Aronica, the house manager, kept perfect inventories and a code of discretion that seemed written in invisible ink. No one raised their voice, no one asked questions. Arono's life unfolded with a discipline that avoided surprises, as if he had decided that emotion was an unnecessary expense. Even so, small echoes lingered in the corridors, traces of humanity that sometimes brushed against him without his noticing. It was then that he truly saw her for the first time. Clara was arranging a bouquet in the main hall. There was no haste in her hands. Her calm was born of practice and affection. Her full figure made no effort to hide itself, and her beauty asked no permission. She was a woman with warm eyes, a reserved smile, and footsteps that seemed to ask the floor not to feel lonely. As Alejandro passed by, he caught a scent of vanilla and coffee that came from no candle. It was rare for him to pause before an employee. He had learned that closeness confused roles and expectations, and from confusion gossip was born, capable of rotting even the finest house from within. Yet he stopped, as if his own feet had decided to interrupt his routine. Clara greeted him without ceremony, her voice soft and comforting, like a winter coat. "Good evening, sir," she said, and returned to her flowers with a gentle gesture. Alejandro went up to his study and reviewed the reports he needed to sign in the morning. Graphs, projections, letters of intent, names that opened doors, figures that guaranteed applause. He finished with his usual rigor and felt that emptiness again, a glass that could be filled but never tasted of anything. He went down to the kitchen, intending to get some water, to give his body a little warmth. He did not expect to find anyone awake. Clara was there, her hair tied back, a steaming cup in her hands. She had placed a small pot on a low flame, and the aroma spread patiently through the room. She did not wish to intrude, but when she saw him enter, she offered a simple gesture. "You look tired," she said softly. "I made coffee for the night guards, but there's enough for you. If you'd like, I can serve you some." Alejandro hesitated for a moment. It was not in his habits to receive gestures of care at odd hours, yet the offer felt so natural, so unpretentious, that it quietly dismantled his defenses. He accepted. He sat on the high stool by the granite island and watched Clara pour the coffee with almost ceremonial focus. The cup was warm, not scalding, as if she knew that too much heat could also hurt. He took a sip and felt a strange relief, a tender warmth beneath his ribs. He told her it was perfect. She smiled, a mix of pride and modesty that he couldn't quite interpret. It wasn't flirtation, nor was it distance. It was something else, a quiet grace that asked for nothing. They spoke carefully. She mentioned that the afternoon rain had stirred up the scent of earth in the garden, and that the lemon trees had seemed grateful. He spoke of simple things, the city growing upward, the avenues that looked like oceans of headlights. There were no intrusive questions, no guarded answers. There were comfortable pauses, silences that didn't weigh heavy. Alejandro noticed that Clara listened with her whole being, as if every word deserved a clean place on the table. He thanked her for the coffee and stood. She cleared the space with practiced ease, leaving no trace behind. Before leaving, he felt the need to say something more but couldn't find the right tone. "Good night," he finally said, an elegant awkwardness. Clara replied that he should rest. her voice leaving a soft trail in the air, a gentle current that followed him down the hallway. He went to his room and opened the window to breathe in the scent of the wet garden. The moon hid itself now and then behind slow-moving clouds. He had trained himself not to think too much about things that couldn't be measured. Yet that night he accepted that something light and real had brushed against him. He remembered the way Clara had tended to the coffee's temperature, how she placed the cup, how she neither tried to guess him nor impress him. Many smiles came to mind, bright, loud, perfect, but none held the quiet depth of hers. He lay down determined to sleep. He reviewed his nightly rituals, measured breathing, ordered thoughts, the mind as a file closing with an invisible click. None of it worked. The stillness of the house became a mirror, and in that mirror he saw Clara standing in the kitchen, holding the pot with the patience of someone who knows the rhythms of water and grain. The image carried a tenderness that refused to let him rest. It wasn't hurried desire. It was something else. An intuition. He thought about risk. In his world, that word was a figure to analyze, a percentage to accept or reject. But here risk had a different arithmetic, one that couldn't fit into charts. To allow himself to feel, to allow someone to cross the elegant walls he had built with discipline. Who was this woman? That her presence could move foundations untouched by either scandal or admiration. Perhaps it was only exhaustion, he told himself. Tomorrow would be another neat page in his notebook. He closed his eyes and saw again the scene in the hall, Clara arranging flowers with a delicacy that seemed to speak to the world in silent words. He wondered how many times he had passed her without truly seeing her. The thought stung. Maybe it had been easier to deny tenderness than to admit he needed it. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling, as if there lay the map of an unknown land. Then, with a start that was not sadness, he realized that for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone. The dawn crept in softly. Alejandro shifted in bed and imagined the kitchen once more. He knew almost nothing about her, and that mystery was both beautiful and overwhelming. He wanted to ask her about her tastes, her music, the stories people keep locked away. He wanted to know the name of every corner she inhabited when no one was watching. He wanted to find the right words to thank her for that cup of coffee that had arrived like a lighthouse in the fog. And as sleep finally resisted him, he discovered that something in Clara's smile followed him through the house, like a whisper of promise. He did not say it aloud, but he knew it. That night, without realizing it, he had taken his first step toward love. And then he understood. Sometimes, insomnia is also a beginning. The first light of dawn slipped through the mansion's tall windows as if someone had tried to paint the shadows in gold. Alejandro was already up, impeccable as always, his suit molded to discipline and his watch marking time with the same precision as his habits. But something inside him no longer followed the same rules. Since that night, the memory of Clara had settled in his mind like a quiet melody he could not silence. He didn't speak of it, not even to himself, but every morning he found an invisible reason to walk through the halls where she worked. At first it was an involuntary act, a coincidence that might have seemed accidental. He would come down for breakfast earlier than usual, even when he wasn't hungry, just to see her setting the table with an order that felt harmonious, not rigid. Then he realized he enjoyed hearing her hum old songs while she tended to the flowers in the hall. There was something in her voice that made him feel at home, a tone absent from the voices of the women who surrounded him in his business meetings. Clara, for her part, noticed the change. At first, she watched him with respect and distance. She knew who that man was, his reputation, his calm authority, the way the world revered him like a modern king. But those days, he looked different. He no longer seemed carved from marble. He appeared more human when he paused to listen to her talk about the garden, or when he answered her simple comments with a faint smile. And though she kept telling herself it was only politeness, deep down she felt something slipping quietly between caution and trembling. One morning, while the rest of the staff finished their chores, Alejandro went down to the garden with a cup of coffee he had made himself. It was a symbolic act, as though breaking his own protocol. Clara was watering the hydrangeas. She wore a blue work dress that complemented her skin, and a wide-brimmed hat barely shaded her face. He paused, watching how the sunlight filtered through the leaves and danced on the mist rising from the water. "You like plants," he said, breaking the silence with a voice gentler than usual. "They are grateful," she replied. "They ask for nothing but care and a little affection." He nodded. "And still so few know how to give it," he murmured, more to himself than to her. That brief conversation was enough for Alejandro to feel something shift. He found himself looking for ways to prolong those small encounters. He started eating lunch at home more often, walking through the halls without reason, pausing in places where he knew she would be. It wasn't immediate desire. It was curiosity, a new need to understand what drew him to this woman who neither tried to impress him nor feared his title. The following days filled with quiet exchanges. They talked about the weather, the scent of freshly baked bread, the music Clara had listened to as a child. Alejandro, used to speeches about numbers and strategies, was surprised by how much he enjoyed subjects he had once found trivial. Clara told him she had grown up in a small coastal town, that her mother had been a seamstress and her father a fisherman. Life had given her no luxuries, but it had given her the gift of finding beauty in the ordinary. Alejandro listened with genuine attention, as if each word wove a story he wanted to follow to the end. The mansion's staff began to notice the closeness. Whispers multiplied in the corridors, disguised between trays and dishes. Veronica, the house manager, was the first to show her discontent. She had worked for Alejandro for many years, knew his routines, his temperament, his precise way of keeping distance. She admired him, and secretly desired him. Veronica convinced herself that Clara was a threat. "It's subters not proper for a maid to be so familiar with the boss," she said one day, feigning concern. "People could misunderstand." Clara lowered her gaze. "I only do my job." "Then make sure it stays that way," Veronica replied, her tone carrying more weight than her words. Clara felt uneasy. She didn't want trouble. That house gave her stability, and her respect for Alejandro was sincere. But she also knew that denying what she was beginning to feel would be lying to herself. Every time he approached, the world seemed to pause for a second. It wasn't mere admiration. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, without adornment or judgment. Alejandro, meanwhile, wrestled with his own confusion. He didn't understand why his mind betrayed him in meetings, why every important decision seemed less urgent than a 5-minute conversation with Clara. He began inventing excuses, checking inventory, asking about the garden, even inquiring about coffee recipes. Any reason was enough to see her. "How do you manage to make the coffee taste the same every time?" he asked one afternoon. "I listen when it boils," she said. "Water has its own language." He smiled. "Then I need to learn that language," he answered, with a look she couldn't hold for long. The tension between them became a thin thread. Neither spoke of what they felt, but every gesture said everything. Their hands brushed when passing a cup. Their eyes met more often than they should. Alejandro started noticing details he'd never paid attention to: the way Clara tied up her hair, the way she laughed when something surprised her, the way her presence made the air warmer. For the first time in a long while, Alejandro felt alive. But the house was no longer the same. Veronica couldn't hide her discomfort, and it spread among the staff. Some began treating Clara with coldness, others with veiled irony. Aware of it, Clara tried to keep her distance, but Alejandro wouldn't allow it. Every time he saw sadness in her eyes, he found a way to return her calm. "Don't burst to worry about what people say," he told her one day, as she served lunch. "People talk because they don't know how to be silent." "Yes, sir. But sometimes words hurt more than actions," she replied, not daring to meet his eyes. He stepped a little closer. "Then let mine heal those wounds." A long silence followed. Clara lowered her gaze and smiled, but her smile carried a new tremor, a premonition of what was to come. That afternoon, the sky darkened early. Thick clouds gathered over the city and rain fell suddenly, like a curtain closing on a stage. Alejandro arrived earlier than usual, soaked from the storm. Clara came to the hall with a towel in her hands, ready to help. The floor was slippery, and as she approached, she tripped on a loose rug. Alejandro caught her before she fell. Their bodies were so close they could hear each other's racing hearts. For an instant that seemed endless, neither moved. The rain pounded the windows, and the world outside disappeared. Clara looked up and saw him as she never had before, without the armor of wealth, without the chill of formality, just a man trembling from within. And he, in turn, found himself unable to let her go. His arms refused to obey reason. When they finally stepped apart, they did so slowly, as if afraid of breaking something fragile and unnamed. "Thank you," she murmured. "Don't thank me," he replied softly. "Maybe I was the one who needed to hold you." And in that phrase, the truth neither dared to say hung suspended. Outside, the storm continued to fall. But inside the house, the air had changed. Something had shifted, and both of them knew it. Neither wanted to name it yet, but it was already too late. Love had begun its path. The days following that rainy afternoon became uncertain ground. Alejandro and Clara tried to behave as if nothing had changed, yet every encounter carried a tension neither could hide. A single look or gesture made the air heavier, more intimate. In the hallways they crossed paths with barely contained smiles and silences that said more than words. And yet the invisible thread between them began to draw other eyes. Rumors appeared quickly. They started among the household staff, innocent-sounding whispers at first. They said Clara lingered too long in the kitchen when Alejandro returned from meetings, that he always found an excuse to speak with her, that something unusual floated between them. And as with all secrets, the more they were denied, the faster they grew. Veronica was the first to give them shape. With her frozen smile and polite tone, she would remark quietly that the boss seemed distracted lately, perhaps confused by an inexperienced woman. Alejandro sensed the shift in the air, though no one dared to confront him. The glances lasted longer. The greetings carried a new tone. He knew his reputation wasn't just personal. It was a currency worth millions in the business world. But that awareness wasn't enough to extinguish what he felt. Each night, when silence surrounded him, his mind returned to Clara, to her calm voice, her unassuming gaze, the warmth that sparked in his chest every time she smiled. Clara, meanwhile, began to feel guilty. She knew people were talking and feared it might harm him. She didn't want to become a stain on his prestige, or a target for gossip. She started to avoid him, leaving before he came downstairs, swapping shifts to prevent coincidence. But distance only fueled what had begun. Alejandro, a man used to getting everything he wanted, discovered that love could neither be negotiated nor bought, and for the first time he feared losing something he never truly possessed. One afternoon, he found her in the garden. The sky had the same gray tone as the storm that had brought them together. Clara was gathering dry leaves, pretending not to notice him, but Alejandro wasn't fooled. He approached with firm steps, though his voice trembled. "Why are you avoiding me?" he asked, a mix of sadness and command in his tone. Clara took a deep breath before answering. "I don't want to cause you trouble, sir. People already talk too much." "Do you care what they say?" he asked more softly. "I don't just." "You may not, but your world does," she said, "and I don't belong to that world." Alejandro took another step closer. "What if I want you to?" Clara met his eyes for the first time without fear. There was a quiet light in them, a mixture of pain and hope. "Don't say that," she whispered. "Don't play with something you don't understand." Alejandro stood still, wounded by her words. Yet deep down he understood she was protecting herself, not out of pride but out of love. "I sup not playing," he said finally. "I haven't stopped thinking about you since that night, since you offered me that coffee. I haven't slept the same." Clara felt the ground vanish beneath her. No one had ever spoken to her with such disarming honesty. She wanted to reply, but words failed her. Alejandro watched her for a moment longer, then took a step that shattered all the rules he had lived by. He reached for her hand, brushed it lightly, just for a second, but it was enough to make the world stop. That touch held more truth than any promise. Clara felt something inside her yield, a wall built from years of fear. She wanted to pull away, but Alejandro held her gently, not with force, but with the tenderness of someone asking permission. "I can pretend anymore," he said. "If I stay away, I lie. When I see you, I live." The afternoon light fell over them like a golden curtain. Silence enveloped them, and in that instant, without calculation or warning, their lips met. It was a slow kiss, restrained at first, as if both feared breaking something sacred. But then it deepened, becoming more human, more real. There was no wealth, no hierarchy, no guilt, only two souls discovering that love could be both shelter and storm. When they finally parted, neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary. Clara lowered her gaze, her hands trembling, and Alejandro brushed her cheek with the gentleness of someone touching a miracle. "Forgive me," she whispered. "There is nothing to forgive," he replied softly. "I only fear never feeling this again if you walk away." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She replayed every second of that kiss as if afraid to forget it. She felt she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Joy and fear, desire and guilt, all coexisted within her. She knew that if anyone discovered them, the scandal would be unstoppable. Yet she also knew she had never felt such peace. For the first time she felt seen, not for her body but for her soul. In the mansion, rumors spread like wildfire. Veronica knew before anyone else. Rage burned her face when she overheard one of the maids say she had seen Alejandro and Clara together in the garden, too close for coincidence. She wasted no time. Discreet messages, careful insinuations, and soon the story began to leak beyond the house. A society photographer, an old acquaintance from glamorous parties, received a tip and decided to follow the magnate. By morning, the scandal exploded like thunder. Digital headlines screamed cruel phrases: the millionaire in love with his plump maid, the forbidden romance of the country's most powerful man. Social media filled with mockery, sarcasm, and disguised judgment. Alejandro found out as soon as he woke up, when his assistant called with a trembling voice. "Sir, the press, they are talking about you and Miss Clara." Alejandro didn't answer immediately. He stared into nothing, trying to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. His entire empire, his reputation, his power was at stake. But what hurt most wasn't that. It was imagining the pain she would endure. He knew how cruel the world could be to those who dared to love beyond convention. He ordered that no one disturb her and locked himself in his study. His hands trembled over the desk. He thought of Clara, her calm voice, her unassuming gaze, her quiet strength. He could deny it, lie, blame her, and save his image. That's what any man in his position would do. But Alejandro no longer wanted to be any man. Meanwhile, Clara sat in her room, phone in hand, tears in her eyes. The photos were everywhere, her smiling walking beside him, and the comments were merciless. She didn't know whether to flee or stay. She loved him, but feared she had ruined his life. He loved him, but feared she had ruined his life. Outside, the rain began again, as if the sky were repeating the scene that had first brought them together. Alejandro closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He knew that night he would have to choose: defend her or leave her to face the world alone. And though the storm's roar drowned every sound, inside his chest one certainty remained: he could not abandon the love he had just found. The following morning brought a storm fiercer than any rain. Newspaper covers filled every window display. Headlines echoed through newscasts, and social media had turned into a feast of cruel comments. The millionaire and his fat maid, they read. Some mocked, others were scandalized. But everyone talked. Alejandro, a man used to controlling every detail of his image, found himself trapped in a hurricane that neither money nor power could stop. At the office, his partners looked at him with a mix of confusion and disapproval. The corridors of his company were thick with tense silence, a murmur spreading like smoke. During one meeting, an older man with a dry voice broke protocol. "Alejandro, this needs to be resolved. Your reputation affects everyone who works with you." He didn't reply immediately. He kept his eyes on the papers, though he wasn't reading. "My personal life isn't a financial product," he finally said calmly. "Your personal life is on every front page," another countered, "and that, whether you like it or not, has a price." Alejandro rose without another word and left the room. He refused to justify his feelings to anyone, but inside he was torn apart. He had built an empire on respect and the illusion of perfection. Now that facade was collapsing under a single word. Meanwhile, Clara was fighting a different kind of war. In the streets, glances turned into knives. At the market, women watched her with ridicule, some with pity, others with contempt. On television, commentators spoke about her with condescending amusement, reducing her story to a cruel joke. What could he possibly see in her? They sneered, and though each word stung, Clara kept her head high, not out of pride, but dignity. She knew giving up would confirm what the world expected, that a woman like her did not deserve love. One night, as the wind battered her window, she thought of leaving. She packed her bag in silence. She didn't want to be a burden or another wound in Alejandro's life. But when her eyes fell on the cup he always used, the same one she'd held the first time she served him coffee, she realized that running away would mean betraying the only real thing she had known in years. She hid the bag beneath the bed and sat down, resolved to endure. Alejandro came to find her that same night. He arrived at the mansion, face weary, suit wrinkled. He had spent the entire day in crisis meetings, fielding calls from lawyers and messages from acquaintances urging him to do the right thing. For them, the right thing meant silence, denial, erasure. But Alejandro had made his decision. "I'm not going to hide you," he said when he saw her. "I won't sit pretend what we have isn't sit real." Clara looked at him, her eyes wet. "They are destroying us, Alejandro. I can fight the whole world." "Then let the world get tired," he replied. "Because I won't give up." That confession left them in silence. They stared at each other, two lonely souls battered by judgment but bound by something deeper than logic. Alejandro approached her slowly, as if afraid to break the fragile moment. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. This time there was no restraint, no fear. It was a kiss that asked for refuge, one that mingled gratitude, desire, and pain. The rain fell again, a silent witness to their surrender. Alejandro led her to his room, not as a master, but as a man seeking shelter in another heart. Every movement was tenderness, not possession. Clara, who had spent her life hiding her body in shame, saw herself as beautiful through his eyes. Alejandro, who had touched perfection in other bodies without feeling anything, found himself vulnerable for the first time. In the dim light, they undressed from the world and from their fears, their breathing mixed with the rhythm of the storm. There was no hurry, only the need to recognize each other, to know they were real. When their hands met, Clara trembled, not from fear, but from truth. Alejandro touched her as one touches a long-awaited secret. Between whispers, they made silent promises, as if time itself had stopped. It was a night where love and passion intertwined with the fragility of two souls who knew that, come morning, they would have to face the world again. At dawn, Clara watched him sleep. There was something different about him now. He was no longer the untouchable man from the magazines, but someone human, imperfect, alive. She realized she loved him with a depth she had never known, and also understood that such depth came at a price. Alejandro woke soon after. He dressed quietly without his usual stiffness. When she tried to speak, he placed a finger gently on her lips. "Let me handle this my way," he said firmly. "I can let them keep hurting you because of me." Clara shook her head. "You don't have to face the world for me." "It's not for you," he replied. "It's for us." He left the room with determination. That morning he was scheduled for a press conference about his business ventures, but his mind was elsewhere. As he entered the auditorium, camera flashes blinded him. Reporters shouted his name. Hungry for the statement everyone awaited, he sat before the microphones, calm, as if about to change his destiny. "Before we begin," he said clearly, "I want to talk about something not related to business but to my life." The room fell silent. Every lens focused on him. "Much has been said about my relationship with someone who works with me. Some have mocked it, others have treated it with disdain. But the truth is, I'm not ashamed of what I feel. I'm in love with Clara, and no, I don't care what people call her. I'm not ashamed of her body, her past, or her condition. I would only be ashamed to keep living without acknowledging the truth." A wave of murmurs swept the room. Journalists scribbled frantically, some in disbelief, others with admiration. Alejandro continued. "For years I believed success meant having everything. Today I understand that you have nothing if you don't know how to love." He ended the conference and left without taking questions. Outside, the rain was still falling, but it no longer felt like a threat. For the first time in a long while, Alejandro felt free. At the mansion, Clara heard the news on the radio. At first, she couldn't believe it. Then, hearing his voice speak her name with such pride, tears streamed down her face. They weren't tears of fear, but of relief. Amid ridicule and scandal, a man had chosen to love her without conditions. Outside, the world kept talking, but she no longer listened. Her heart, for the first time, felt no shame. She knew there were battles ahead, but she also knew one thing with certainty: when love is true, it always finds a way to endure. Alejandro's public declaration changed the air of the city. For a few days, courage became a headline, and tenderness, a piece of news. But euphoria fades quickly when reality comes to collect its dues. Conservative clients demanded guarantees. Analysts questioned his stability on talk shows, and his partners, offended by the exposure, began murmuring in private dining rooms, with linen napkins and frozen smiles. Life went on, yes, but it was no longer the same. And amid that whirlwind, Clara began to feel like a weight on the scale of a man accustomed to winning. It wasn't a sudden thought. It dripped into her mind slowly. A look in the elevator, a comment disguised as small talk, a headline that mentioned falling stock prices with the same ease it mocked her body. Clara found herself measuring every gesture, every step, as if the entire house were wrapped in glass. She tried to smile the same way, to prepare coffee with the same patience, to speak with the same calm, but nothing sounded the same when the world sharpened its tongue just beyond the door. Veronica, the house administrator, knew how to use the crack that had opened. She had waited patiently for this moment. With a coldness that bordered on devotion, she began meeting with key investors, invoking the need to protect the company's value. Her tone in those meetings was that of someone praying for another's salvation. She spoke of reputation, stability, fiduciary responsibility. She never spoke Clara's name with open disdain, but she let it hang in the air after each pause, like a tasteless ornament that everyone saw yet no one dared to touch. At one of those meetings, a businessman with a deep voice asked her what she intended to achieve. Veronica folded her hands perfectly composed and replied that they adored Alejandro, but perhaps emotional turbulence was distracting him from prudence. It would be enough, she said, if someone close helped him regain focus. Enough if the house fell silent again. No one answered aloud. It was enough. Clara sensed the hostility in the company halls when she accompanied Alejandro to a charity event. She knew it wasn't her place, but he had asked her to go. He held her hand naturally, and for a moment she thought the world might learn to look with softer eyes. It didn't. As they left, a woman wrapped in perfume and self-confidence whispered that love also demanded sacrifice, especially when one was the obstacle. Clara froze, her polite smile trembling. That night she lay awake, repeating the word until it lost its meaning. Obstacle, obstacle, obstacle. Alejandro was fighting his own battle. He had discovered, with a mix of sweetness and anguish, that to love is to choose every single day. He chose Clara over schedules, over opinions, over applause. Yet the weight of pressure tightened around him like a chain. His partners demanded action. His family, distant and immaculate, suggested discretion. His high society friends, the kind who lingered over long dinners, called his romance an adventure and advised a prudence that smelled of cowardice. One afternoon, Veronica asked to speak with him privately. She met him in the library, surrounded by rows of gilded books that seemed to judge in silence. Alejandro, she began, her voice cold and gentle, I say this with affection and loyalty. They want to see you fall. You don't but know me, he replied steadily. If you think I sup, I'm afraid of losing. It sits not fear, she countered. It sits cost. Your decisions are costing us. Unsettled investors, frozen projects, unanswered calls, all for a story that might be beautiful but reckless. Alejandro placed his hands on the table. I once said give up Clara. Is not asking you to, she insisted. I sump begging you to move her out of the light. Keep your relationship private. Remove that woman from the house, from the staff, from public view. Protect what you built. The words that woman struck like a splinter. Alejandro took a slow breath. Clara has a name and dignity. I will never hide her again. If that sep's uncomfortable, we shall adjust the business but not the love. Veronica didn't argue. As she left, she dropped one last phrase like a napkin being folded. I only hope that kind of romanticism can pay salaries and keep contracts afloat. Clara had overheard fragments of their conversation from the hallway. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words reached her like inevitable rain. That night a dark thought wrapped itself around her heart. Maybe she was the line in the sand. On one side love, on the other livelihood's dreams, the empire itself. She rose from bed and walked the silent mansion. She looked at the walls, the paintings, the corners that had once felt like home. Now the house wasn't a place, it was a test. The next day, Alejandro called a meeting with the senior partners. There was no polite prelude. If my personal life is the problem, he said steadily, I can arrange an orderly transition. I will not sacrifice love to maintain the illusion of a perfect leader. I'd rather have a small loyal team than an empire chained to fear. Muffled gasps filled the room, eyes darted toward exits. One partner tried to persuade him with numbers, another with talk of legacy. Alejandro listened in silence, then answered with calm conviction. A legacy without truth is just a portrait on a wall. My decision is made. The news leaked that same afternoon. Veronica, who thought she controlled the board, felt the game slipping through her fingers. In quiet fury, she moved a harsher piece. She tipped off a financial journalist that Alejandro planned to sell part of his holdings. Within hours, the story broke, and the markets trembled. The pressure reached its peak. Clara saw Alejandro's face when he returned home. It was the face of a man who had fought all day and refused to rest. She approached him with gentle warmth, asking for no permission. If I weren't sit here, she murmured, you would have had a peaceful day. Without you, he replied, I wouldn't have had a real one. They dined in silence. He held her hand across the table, and she let that warmth pass through her. Later they climbed to the terrace to look at the sky. Below them the city glittered like a restless swarm of fireflies. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, and felt the calm that comes when one knows they've been chosen. She thought love could withstand anything as long as he looked at her that way. She thought love was a refuge that demanded courage. But that courage turned into a question by dawn. She woke with a feeling she couldn't name. She sat at her desk under a small lamp, as if not wanting the house to notice. Words flowed slowly, woven with painful tenderness. She wrote about their first coffee, their first silence, their first kiss. She asked Alejandro not to stop loving because of others' fear. She thanked him for the dignity with which he had always looked at her, for giving her back her name. And she told him that sometimes love means stepping aside so it doesn't destroy everything in its path. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the kitchen table beside his favorite cup. She kissed the rim, as if leaving a charm in the porcelain. Then she looked out at the garden, now pale as a blank page, and left without a sound. When morning came, Alejandro looked for her with the rhythm of their happy days. She wasn't in the kitchen, nor the hall, nor the garden. He called her name in a voice that tried to sound calm, but couldn't. Veronica appeared down the corridor, her usual composure hiding a strange gleam in her eyes. He walked past her without seeing her. In the kitchen, he found the letter folded neatly, like a keepsake. He opened it with hands that already knew. He read slowly, pausing between lines, as if trying to delay the inevitable blow. When he finished, silence filled everything. There was no shout, no crash, no desperate chase, only certainty. Clara had vanished without a trace, except for that farewell that was also a declaration of love. Alejandro pressed the paper to his chest, and for the first time in years, let pain pass through him unresisted. Outside, the city woke to another day of business. Inside, a man finally understood that the greatest battle was only just beginning. The days passed like an open wound. Alejandro stopped attending meetings, canceled trips, postponed agreements he once considered untouchable. The mansion, once a temple of order and purpose, had turned into an echo. The cups stayed in their place, the clocks kept time, but he was no longer there. His body moved through the rooms. His mind wandered through memories. Every corner spoke of her, the scent of coffee, the flowers in the hall. Even the murmur of the garden reminded him that Clara had been there, and now only silence remained. At first, he tried to find her with the precision he used to solve a financial crisis. He called old contacts, reviewed footage, requested discretion. But soon he realized that searching for a person wasn't like closing a deal. Resources and influence weren't enough. Clara had vanished with the delicacy of someone who doesn't want to be found. And in that mapless search, Alejandro discovered how poor all his supposed power really was. He left the company in trusted hands and departed the city. He wandered through nearby towns, modest inns, small cafes where his name meant nothing. He traveled in silence, wearing a worn coat and a lost look. Every time someone served him coffee, he remembered her smile, the way she looked at him without asking for anything, the trembling of her hands the night they kissed for the first time. One afternoon, he arrived in a quiet neighborhood of narrow streets and the smell of fresh bread. As he walked aimlessly, he saw through the window of a small cafe a silhouette that stopped his heart. It was her. Clara, wearing a beige apron, her hair tied back, was serving coffee to an elderly woman with the same patience he had loved from the very first day. For a moment, he thought destiny might make sense after all. Without thinking, he entered, driven by something stronger than reason. The bell over the door chimed softly. Clara looked up, and the world stopped. Neither of them spoke right away. Words would have shattered the fragile magic of that instant. The time that had separated them dissolved like sugar in hot water. She was the first to speak. "How did you find me?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling despite her calm. "I don't know," he replied. "Maybe it wasn't set me who found you. Maybe it was love that refused to lose you." Clara set down the tray and approached him slowly. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. "You shouldn't have come. I left so you could find peace." "I have no peace without you," he said. "I tried, I swear. But everything I touch without you hurts." The silence that followed was like a caress. Alejandro took another step forward and held her hands. "I don't want you to come back as an employee," he continued. "I don't want you making coffee for me or arranging flowers in my house. I want you to come back as my partner, as the woman I love, as my life." Clara looked at him tenderly. She had dreamed of hearing those words, though fear had made her doubt them. "I don't know if I could live in your world," she murmured. "Then let's change the world together," he said, with a tired but certain smile. "I don't need anyone's approval. I need your laughter in the morning, your quiet at night, your peace in the noise." The tears she had held back for weeks finally overflowed. She embraced him tightly, and Alejandro, who had faced hostile boards, financial losses, and public storms, understood that true victory was that simple embrace. Outside, the afternoon sun turned the street golden. Inside the little cafe, two souls found each other again. No witnesses, no contracts, no promises beyond the wish to stay. Alejandro stayed by her side the rest of the day. He helped clean tables, collect cups, and close the shop. He felt joy sweeping the floor, as if each stroke erased what remained of his pride. Clara watched him silently, realizing that the man before her was no longer the one from the headlines, but a human being ready to start anew. When they said goodbye to the elderly owner, Alejandro asked for permission to visit again the next day. The man nodded with a knowing smile. That night, they walked under the streetlights, unhurried, talking about everything and nothing. Alejandro told her he had paused all his businesses, that he no longer wanted to lead a world without meaning. Clara spoke of her new life, of waking early to need bread, of the peace in living simply. They both discovered happiness hidden in things neither had noticed before. Days later, they returned to the city together, but not to the mansion. Alejandro sold part of his properties and bought a smaller, brighter house with a garden where Clara planted the same hydrangeas she had once watered in the rain. The criticism didn't stop, but it no longer mattered. They learned to laugh at the headlines, to ignore the whispers, to walk hand in hand without fear. Months passed. They organized a small ceremony. No cameras, no obligations. Only those who had stood by them without judgment. A few close friends, the old cafe owner, the flower sellers from the market, and Alejandro's most loyal team. Clara wore an ivory dress without adornment. Alejandro, a gray suit with no tie, and a white flower on his lapel. They married in the garden at sunset, while a soft breeze danced through the petals. There was no orchestra, no rehearsed speeches, only laughter, tears, and the feeling that every hardship had been worth it. When the judge declared them husband and wife, Alejandro kissed her with the same reverence as that first night, the same certainty that one cup of coffee had changed his life. Clara whispered softly into his ear, "Now I sapone home." And he replied, "You shall never leave again." That night, after the guests departed and the lights dimmed, they sat together in the garden. They looked up at the sky and understood that life, with all its trials and wounds, had led them exactly there. They weren't the perfect couple the world dreamed of. They were two real people who had learned that true love fears neither ridicule nor judgment, for its strength lies in honesty. Alejandro took Clara's hand and kissed it gently. "I searched for you everywhere," he said, "and in the end I realized love isn't set to something you find, it's set to something you recognize. You were the home I didn't know I needed." She rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, silence didn't hurt. There was only calm. The mansion, the wealth, the titles, all seemed distant, irrelevant. What mattered was that shared moment, that truth too vast for newspapers or balance sheets. The wind stirred the flowers in the garden, and Clara smiled. "Do you know what I've learned from all this?" she asked. "What?" he replied. "That love can be bought, measured, or calculated. It can only be lived." Alejandro smiled, gazing at her with the same admiration as on the first day. "And if you too believe that love knows nothing of bodies or fortunes," he said, looking toward the horizon, his voice reaching every soul that had ever doubted its worth, subscribe, share, and join us for the next story that might change the way you see the heart. The sun sank behind the trees, and for a moment everything was wrapped in golden silence. Two empty cups on a table, a garden full of life, and the echo of a story reminding the world that true love always finds its way back.